Hello, everyone. Welcome to Exploring Tough Policy Issues through an AUW Lens webinar on the student debt crisis. My name is Robin Lucas. My pronouns are she, her, and I am the Grassroots Advocacy Manager here at AAUW. So thank you for joining us to learn about the student debt crisis. Since its first meeting in 1881, AAUW has been a catalyst for change. That change started with advocating for increased support and access to affordable higher education for women, which our mission specifically identifies as also alleviating the debt burden as a key priority, as it disproportionately impacts women borrowers and borrowers of color, and exacerbating the gender and racial wealth gaps. Today, we will outline what we're talking about when we say student debt crisis and what that burden means to people on more of an individual level. Before we get into it though, Barbara, would you introduce yourself and our partners?
Hi, I'm Barbara Price, Chair of the AAUW Public Policy Committee. This webinar could not have come at a more perfect time, as the discussion of student debt seems to be in the news on a regular basis. We are thrilled to be joined today by speakers from two of our coalition partners. Catherine Welbeck is Director of Advocacy and Civil Rights Council for the Student Borrower Protection Center, a nonprofit organization focused on alleviating the burden of student debt for millions of Americans. They engage in advocacy, policymaking, and litigation strategy to rein in industry abuses, protect borrowers' rights, and advance economic opportunity for the next generation of students. Our second speaker is Natalia Abrams, President and founder of the Student Debt Crisis Center, a nonprofit organization solely focused on ending the student debt crisis. By centering the needs and voices of borrowers and partnering with allies, SDCC believes we have to act now to address the immediate needs of borrowers and fix the failed policy experiment of debt-financed higher education. But first, let's take a look at the broader issue in order to put this all in context. Borrowers now hold over $1.7 trillion in student loan debt, with women holding nearly 2/3 of that debt and Black women taking on the most substantial debt burden. Over the past 40 years, the cost of college has increased dramatically. A generation ago, 1 year of a 4-year college cost 22% of the median household income. The number has soared to 43% today. While the price tag of a college education has more than doubled over the past generation, household income has risen only marginally, only 14%. Nearly 68% of undergraduate students now have to take on debt for their degree. And as women graduate, their student debt repayment collides with the gender pay gap. Let's take a look at what this means on an individual level, where we have a simple monthly budget from AUW's Deeper in Debt report. It calculates monthly costs for housing, utilities, vehicle and medical expenses, and food to an average of $1,979 a month, and an average of $307 a month for student loan payments, leaving the average woman in this country with $148 a month. This does not account for childcare, which, using a national average of $508 a month, would leave her with a $372 deficit. Neither of these calculations factor in a savings plan, emergency fund, or other basic expenses like clothing, toiletries, household supplies, gas, and tolls. This is all calculated on an average anticipated salary of just over $35,000 upon graduation. Some of these numbers might look accurate for your living area, and some of them, particularly housing or the student loan payment itself, may seem incredibly high or low, depending on the cost of living in your area. Regardless if it seems high or low to you, the result is the same. The burden of student debt weighs heavily on women in the United States. As a result, women often put off saving for retirement, buying a home, or starting a family. I'll give it back to Robin now.
Thank you, Barbara. In addition to providing the research vital to much of our work on the student debt crisis, AAUW engages directly on several fronts. First, the member-voted AAUW public policy priorities are voted on by members every 2 years and keep the student debt crisis in a high priority. It states, we advocate for increased and more equitable access to higher education that is affordable and yields high-quality credentials or degrees. We promote intentional equity-focused efforts to close the persistent learning and opportunity gaps that disproportionately affect students from low-income and minority groups. And the importance of addressing student debt in our priorities provides the mandate driving our research and policy work in the area. 2, working in coalition with other gender equity and education organizations is a key strategy to our work. Today's webinar being a prime example of how working together is crucial. In addition to today's partners, we would like to highlight the coalitions we are our partner in as well. There is the Education Task Force of the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights and Higher Ed Not Debt. Through Coalition, we engage directly with decision makers and the public through calls, letters to political offices, and comments and testimonies on hearings. And then finally, that third pillar of our work is each of you on this call today. Educating and mobilizing AAUW advocates and members through targeted calls to action on important legislation is a critical piece of our work. And providing voter education resources on key equity issues to consider during elections and offering information on how elected officials have voted in the past is another piece of that important work. With that big picture in mind, the fight to end the student debt crisis must address issues on many levels. It is helpful to keep some of the policy goals we're all working towards in mind as our partners go over their compelling information from their own research and community storytellers today. To summarize the many ways our organizations address the issues of student debt, here on this slide are several policy solutions that we advocate for. First being broad cancellation of student debt. Any debt cancellation plan must be intentional and equitable, so we keep an eye on that in our policy work, with a focus on ensuring that the needs of the highest impacted borrowers are addressed. AAUW ourselves work in coalition to call for a $50,000 debt cancellation. We also work on streamlining the repayment processes, including income-driven repayment plans. And as Barbara mentioned, we will continue to talk about today, the gender pay gap is a critical compounding issue. So passing the Paycheck Fairness Act is included in ending the student debt crisis. We also have more policy solutions that include increasing and ensuring access to federal and state funding, expanding and reauthorizing service programs to make education more accessible to all students, including parents. This list is no way exhaustive, but it is a high-level idea of key strategies to ending the student debt crisis. We'll talk more about these goals and more throughout the webinar. On that note, we're going to hand the mic first to Kat and then Natalia to share what their organizations are doing to end the student debt crisis. Kat, could you tell us what you work on at the Student Borrowers Protection Center?
Yes, and thank you so much. And Robin, while I get my screen shared, I just want to start by thanking both you and Barbara so much for the opportunity to join today. I'm really excited to be a part of AAUW's programming and then also join with Natalia. So I guess what I'll do is I'll start with a little bit of framing of what I'm going to talk about today. And I love both your introduction and Barbara's introduction because I think it leads so well into what I want to talk about with the student debt crisis. But I really want to talk about what problems arise from having a debt finance higher education system and how that really brought us to where we are in this current crisis. So I'm going to start by with a little bit of framing the student debt crisis. I think it's important to understand, how we got here in order to talk about what are the changes to fix a systemic issue. And then also, I think when we start by acknowledging the systemic inequities and barriers that lead many students to take on significant debt burdens, what also affects the way that different students, particularly women and students of color, experience repayment because of other inequities, I think it helps us think about how we create and advocate for solutions and strategies that are that are centered in the needs of borrowers and in easing debt burdens in an equitable way. So with that, I'll begin with this slide, but I think it's really great because Barbara did a lot of this in her framing. But so as we see, what many of us know is that the student debt crisis has really grown exponentially over the past decade. And I know it was really helpful too with Barbara talking about the rising costs even over the past several decades. But what we really have seen, especially in this past 10 years or so in the student debt crisis, is the combined effects of when we were thinking about wage stagnation. We're talking about rising college costs. We're also talking about a lot of wealth that was lost during the Great Recession. And then also at that same time, less public and state investment and funding in higher education. But the thing is, people were still going to school at record rates, because again, we're told that education is a tool of social mobility. So what happens when the state says, we're not going to carry that burden of education? We actually force that cost onto families, so they're footing a greater share of the bill, which we think about what does that mean for students who come from low wealth families. So again, that means a lot of times this is going to come in the form of debt. If you do not have familial wealth to help you pay for college, that is going to be taken on in the form of student debt. And when we're thinking about what those disparities look like in our country and who takes on more debt, you can imagine what that looks like, and we'll get to that over the next slide. But what we really see is that student debt is about more than a monthly payment. A lot of times, we talk about the bill, which is really critical, right? Because it's also people having less money in their pocket, less opportunities to build wealth, but it affects on so many other ways in people's livelihood. So again, thinking about education as a tool of social mobility, but then we look at the ways that student debt time and time again keeps people from being able to access economic opportunities. So this true cost extends in many ways. So it means that people might be forced to pay tens and thousands of more dollars in terms of credit when they're buying a house, or if they can't even, save enough money to buy it, to get a down payment on the house. If you do try to access other credit, are you paying more for other credit when you're purchasing a car? Because of the way that your debt to income ratio is so high with student debt. And so we see that it's affecting people being able to take these steps across their economic lives. But then we also see, again, it affects a really wide range. Not only is it affecting a generation's ability to, again, save to buy a home, save for retirement. We also see older adults who are not able to retire, or struggling to retire, or have a lot of financial insecurity in their older years, because they either might be paying on their own student debt, they might be paying for their children or grandchildren's student debt. But what we're seeing is that this is also very much so an intergenerational issue. And one thing also, when we're talking about disparities, I really love about framing this conversation in equity, and again, talking about, I really loved the opening in the AAUW Steeper in Debt report, right? Talking about the significant effect of student debt on women, and then thinking about also, as we talk about how student debt is an economic justice issue, how do we become better advocates to change the system and create a more equitable system? We have to talk about the ways that it affects different populations and different communities. So we know that, again, women, and then students of color, particularly those that are Black and Latino, face significant disparities in the student debt crisis. So one thing when we're talking about the disparities in the student debt crisis, I like to frame it through the racial wealth gap, and explain how it means that this affects different opportunities for communities of color, particularly Black and Latino communities, and their ability to access and build wealth. So again, we're talking about student debt. It's not just, again, borrowing for school, but we have to think about the longstanding effects of economic policy, and how the debt crisis is a direct reflection of that discriminatory policy, and continues to perpetuate those systems, with systemic barriers and racial discrimination, how that's all interwoven. So I'm talking about the student debt crisis and the racial wealth gap. I think it helps when you talk about this divide and think about how it becomes intergenerational. So if you have Black and Latino borrowers starting off with less household wealth, so what that means is, when it's time for them to go to school, rather than being able to rely on familial wealth, being able to have their parents help pay for school, they're more likely to take on debt to pay for school. They then leave school with more debt, which cuts into opportunities for wealth building. Again, the ability to save for a home, the ability to retire, the ability, again, just to save for your children's future education, right? And so how that affects these different opportunities for wealth building or wealth creation over a lifetime. And so then when we think about when the same generation is trying to send their own children to college, they have less access to wealth. And so we kind of recreate that cycle. And so what that looks like in numbers, so for example, approximately 90% of Black students and 72% of Latino students take on debt to attend college, in comparison to about 66% of white students. All of those numbers are extremely high. This is also why we're advocating for, why we're gonna get to talking about debt cancellation, talking about reforming our student loan system. But then again, what we see is there are also significant struggles in repayment in the same way that we talk about the fact that the wage gap affects women's ability to pay on debt, it affects household pay. We also see those gaps affect Black borrowers, Latinos borrowers' ability to repay their debt. But what we also see is over time is that Black borrowers' debt tends to grow, same with Latino borrowers. So we have studies that show even 12 years after beginning college, the median Latino borrower still owes 83% of their initial balance, compared to the median white borrower who's paid down nearly half of their balance. And similarly, after 20 years of starting college, the median Black borrower still owes 95% of their balance, whereas the median white borrowers pay down almost 95% of their balance. So we see different ways, and we're going to talk a little bit about income-driven repayment and talk about some of the ways that non-amortizing debt really continues to play into this racial wealth gap. But again, I keep saying this all cuts into wealth building opportunities. This cuts into people's abilities to have opportunity. And so we're going to talk a little bit about what do these solutions look like. So I know I'm talking a little bit about a lot about lending based on like student debt based on wealth disparities, but I also want to talk about the student debt crisis is also a crisis of predatory targeting. So in addition to higher balances, we also have issues with student loan servicers giving people bad information that keeps them in debt much longer than they should be when they're entitled to debt relief. We hear countless stories about people who haven't been told about their opportunities to access debt forgiveness or debt programs. We have government programs that, again, that are supposed to give people access to debt relief that have been mismanaged both through different administrations and, again, servicers that have kept people from being able to access the intended relief that they're entitled to. And then we even have different companies, whether it's predatory private lending companies or for-profit schools, literally targeting certain communities to prey on them and to help them amass and to cause them to amass more debt. So I also want to talk about the ways that we also have to have an accountability piece, whether that's the Department of Education, whether that's the CFPB, also holding bad actors accountable when there are many ways that we can be protecting borrowers from a consumer protection front. But and so all of this is to say, when we talk about our student debt system being broken, it's broken on multiple levels. And so we're talking about how do we fix it? We have to have multifaceted solutions. So not only do we have to fix the systemic disparities that cause certain people to have more debt just by the fact that we have this longstanding and continued history of discrimination in our country, but then we also have to talk about the ways that so many borrowers in every corner of this country are entitled to various programs and access to relief and have been denied that because they've been lied to, they've been given the wrong information, or when government agencies are supposed to be holding bad actors accountable, they kind of have been a little bit asleep at the wheel. And so what does it mean now to be in an administration that's going to say, are we going to hold services accountable, but also are we also going to fix the programs that have been broken? And so one example that we have is the Public Service Loan Forgiveness Program, as you can see through the slide. It's been notoriously broken. So in the 14 years of its history, until recently, there was over a 98% rejection rate for this program. The promise should be pretty simple. 10 years in public service, equals your debt should be canceled. There's some other qualifications in the program, but it should be pretty simple. But so many people were denied relief based on administrative burdens. But again, part of today is, right, we're talking about advocacy. So how do we change that? How do we change knowing the fact that we have a broken system? We have administration that came in with promises to fix a broken system. Well, one amazing thing is I think PSLF, the Public Service Loan Forgiveness Program, has given us an example of what happens when we bring our voices together and say we have an unjust system, we have a broken system, and it's not working for borrowers. So when the administration came in and said, what do we need to do to fix different programs, right? And so one of the ones they started with was talking about public service loan forgiveness, because it notoriously had denied borrowers access to relief, even after, borrowers did their commitment, they worked for 10 years in public service, but weren't getting the relief that they were entitled to. So over a 60-day period, when the Department of Education asked for comments, and again, many people on this call in coalition together submitted comments to the Federal Register. Over 50,000 people raised their voices and said, this is not it. The system is broken. It has failed us. I have helped up my commitment to serve my community, but I've been lied to by a servicer. They didn't tell me about opportunities for relief. And the Department of Education, the Biden administration, said, we're going to change this. And so for a year period of time, so from October 6, 2021 through October 31st of this year, they created a limited PSLF waiver. So many people who previously had been denied access to relief to this program are given the opportunity to engage with this limited waiver to get credit for public service loan forgiveness. And so on this slide, I know I'm talking a little bit about what happens when we raise our voices together and what happens when we take the groundswell of this energy and this movement on student debt and we petition the government. One, we got to change, but I also too want to put this here because I know there might be many people on this call here who might be able to benefit from it. So I also want to pivot for a little bit and tell people about opportunities to gain access to this program. So if this applies to you, I also want to include this here. But for the limited waiver, again, it's for people who work in public service. So again, for example, 501c3 nonprofits, people who have military service, certain healthcare workers and professionals. If you're working in a public setting, again, a lot of examples. I know we had like teachers, nurses, firefighters, so many of these different professions. But again, if you work in public service, if you work in legal aid, the list goes on. But you can have access to public service loan forgiveness. Previously, people had certain older loans, so this might have been Fell loans or Perkins loans. There were certain type of loans where you may have previously been told your loan doesn't qualify you for PSLF. If you try to get to this program, you're going to lose all the previous payments that you've made under that previous loan. But now with this limited waiver, what the Department of Education is saying, pretty much for forgiveness, regardless of what type of federal loan you have, for any period of time since October 1st, 2007, when the program began, as long as you were in a qualifying public service employment and your loan was not in default, and there's a new waiver, deferment or forbearance, and there are a couple exceptions to deferment and forbearance that you can get credit for PSLF payments. So I just want to put this out there. We'll share resources in a site, but I want to let people know you previously may have been told that you didn't have access to PSLF, but there are a lot of people who filled out a form saying they worked in public service. Many people may have had federal loans that weren't direct loans and didn't know that you can get access to this program. But I do want to let you know that this exists, and also just again talking about the power of advocacy and how we're seeing change. And I know I'm getting really close to time, and so I'll quickly talk about some other things that we've seen in the student debt, in student loan issues over the past year because of advocacy, right? Because of everyone here lifting their voices, because of 50,000 people flooding the Federal Register and saying and demanding that they want change. So again, the payment pause has been extended. I think many people here know through August 31st, 2022. But again, reminding people to continue to raise the voice, talking about the effects of student debt and telling your stories and how the power of that storytelling is really moving and changing policy and moving the needle. Also, default, the Department of Education, during this period of time where payments are on pause, the Department of Education is committed to moving people who were previously in default out of default before payments are turned back on. And that's a really big deal for people who may have been subject to administrative wage administrative wage garnishment, or people who may have have had a tax refund offset, or may have had their social security benefits offset because of default. So those people will be moved back into regular repayment, and we'll get more details about that. Also, I mentioned the public service loan forgiveness waiver, and then also fixes to income driven repayment. So people who have been on income driven repayment for 20 or 25 years, depending on the payment plan, should have access to loan forgiveness. And what we found out is that the Department of Education, different servicers weren't keeping track of borrowers' payments. So again, many people who have been entitled to debt relief weren't getting access to debt relief, but the Department of Education is going through and going back through the payment history and trying to figure out how to give people credit for payments where they previously weren't giving credit, servicers weren't counting. And we're hoping to see that many thousands of people, hopefully. I mean, our number is saying there are over 4 million people who've been in repayment over 20 years. So there really is a large number of people who can benefit from these changes to the department. But I know Natalia is coming up next, and she's going to say just the amazing work they've done. But again, talking about the importance of what our advocacy as the collective voices of borrowers, how we can change the system, one, for calling for larger systemic changes through broad-based debt cancellation, and then also how we can call for broader changes to our student loan system, and calling on the federal government, calling on the Department of Education to fix these broken programs, to calling on them calling on the CFPB to have greater accountability over student loan servicing, so that people, when they are entitled to debt relief, are getting access to it, because this is your right as a student loan borrower. So I'll stop there because I think I'm a little bit over time.
Well, that was great. Thank you for sharing. Natalia, we'll switch to you now.
Great. Thank you, Robin. And thank you everyone for joining us. Wow, it looks like we have almost 100 people here. That's wonderful. We always say with these virtual events, just like close your eyes and imagine you're in a room and with 100 people. That's huge. So congrats to you all for showing up and being here. And at Student Debt Crisis Center, which I founded, we're deeply committed to centering the needs and voices of borrowers and working collaboratively. I can speak today, I promise you all, with partners and allies, partners like Student Borrower Protection Center and AAUW, to impact policy and, most importantly, help borrowers through their own personal student debt crisis. Stemming from a single borrower petition. So we got our start with Advocacy to forgive student loan debt in 2011. We have grown to engage over 2 million people nationwide. Those 2 million people have taken collectively 5.5 million actions, which are letter sends, petition signatures, and sharing their stories. We have a story bank of over 100,000 stories from student loan borrowers to date. First and foremost, we see ourselves as an organization focused on how the crisis impacts individual borrowers. So we like to provide resources very similar to Student Borrower Protection Center. We provide a suite of tools, repayment information, training opportunities for both advocacy and repayment information to help Americans and borrowers find the information they need to manage their debts and take advantage of existing federal and state programs, which, if you've tried to navigate through them, as Kat was talking about with public service loan forgiveness, they can be quite complicated unnecessarily. And because of that, I've been doing this for over a decade now, and we want to also change the policy to become more impactful and reflect the real concern of borrowers and their families and communities that they call home. We like to feel at Student Debt Crisis Center that we have this unique ability to bridge the gap between borrowers, policymakers, through large-scale targeted educational and engagement campaigns. And we are part of Higher Ed Not Debt, which Robin mentioned as well. And I am a true believer, especially when we got our start as a small grassroots organization, if it wasn't for our partnerships and collaborative work through Coalition, we wouldn't be in this place we are today, where anytime you turn on the news, all you hear about is student loan debt, which, trust me, 10 years ago, it was nothing of the sort. As I mentioned before, one of the things that we feel is so impactful is sharing your story and telling the story of the student debt crisis. Personal stories have the power to express the full impact of student loan debt that Americans face. These stories educate the general public, destigmatize debt. We live in a culture that we often don't talk about our financial woes, and by sharing stories, it helps destigmatize, and people coming forward with their own debt is just so important. And all of that helps us build a community between borrowers and inspire action to shift the public narrative to support policy change. We promote individual stories by sharing with the media, sharing with lawmakers, and with our partners and allies to tell, this collective story of what we're all facing. And Catherine mentioned some of that this is, definitely a multi-generational issue. This impacts people, white borrowers, Black borrowers, brown borrowers, and then women. We know that we have over 1.7, 1.8 trillion, it depends on which clock you look at. Of that, women hold over $1 trillion of student loan debt. And I think that needs to be said again, women hold over $1 trillion. This is a women's student debt crisis. And that's why those of us that work on women's issues and gender issues, student debt, and the economic justice aspect of that really needs to be talked about when it comes to women's issues. And, I encourage you all to share your stories with us or AAUW or Student Borrower Protection Center, so you too can have a direct impact when it comes to elected officials and lawmakers, so we can actually create meaningful change and reform. So it's our mission here at Student Debt Crisis Center not only to operate, not only to end the it's our mission to end the student debt crisis once and for all. I would be happy to be out of a job. This should not be something that goes on in perpetuity. I'd like to think that this crisis has a start date, whether you look at the student loan law changes in 1992 or the financial crash in 2008. There should be a start date, and then we should also have an end date. And we're 20, 30 years into this crisis, depending on when you look at the start date, and it's time for it to end. And we want to address this problem through policy change and reform the higher education funding system to center on fairness, equity, justice, and supporting student and borrower needs. We're always a place, we always want to place the voices and needs of borrowers at the center of our advocacy to achieve our policy goals. Like, if you haven't gotten it enough, we really stress story sharing, because we feel beyond the petition send or the letter, it's the stories of borrowers that have changed the minds of lawmakers. And that's and we believe that borrowers, you yourself as a student loan borrower are the best organizer, and it's as simple as sharing your story. Along with that, because we do have 2 million supporters, most of them student loan borrowers, we, especially through this COVID pandemic, have been conducting research in the form of surveys. And we've been surveying our borrowers for over 2 years. And probably to no surprise to people on this call, but we're saddened to report that the circumstances for student loan borrowers has gotten worse. Our findings have shown that the ongoing pandemic, combined with unprecedented inflation, are huge obstacles for borrowers who are by and large not ready to resume payments, struggling to afford basic needs, and confused about their options moving forward. On top of this unprecedented pause, which, to remind folks, loans have been on pause since March of 2020, right now scheduled to August 30th, 31st of this year. Millions of borrowers are still in the process of who will process their monthly payments if or when they resume, with the largest servicing transition ever to occur for borrowers. We've had Navient, FedLoan, and Cornerstone all pull out of the market, which has left roughly 16 million borrowers needing to be assigned a new loan servicer during this pause time, just to add complication. With both happening at the same time, clear guidance and communication to borrowers from the Department of Education is essential. And our survey, which I'm going to go into in a moment, shows that borrowers are not getting those communications from their loan servicers or accurate communications. So let's go through some of the top lines from our COVID survey. And I'll just say that while we've done 5, the last one was done before the most recent pause. We keep thinking we're done, but as you all know, we haven't fully gotten out of this pandemic. So we probably will be doing a 6th round of our COVID survey to kind of correspond with each one of the payment pauses. But what we find, and it gets worse each time, which is 9 out of 10 fully employed student loan borrowers are concerned about being able to afford their monthly payments due to inflation with the current pause, when the current pause on payments and interest expires. The problem is even more challenging for women who experience the brunt of pandemic-related job loss and reduction in hours. We know that women definitely were the ones to quit their jobs, stay home and take care of their children, or lost jobs during the pandemic. And so this is, again, a women's student debt crisis. 9 out of 10 fully employed borrowers do not agree with the idea that the economy has recovered. This is something we hear often in the news. You know, the economy is great. Look at the stock market. I don't know about you. I can't afford to be invested in the stock market, and many student loan borrowers can't either. So we're not seeing, you know, the increase on our quote investments when we're just struggling to get by. We also know that 1 in 3 borrowers say they reduce spending on necessities, food, rent, healthcare, all in preparation for payments to resume. And over half of student loan borrowers lost their job, had reduced hours, or were furloughed during the pandemic. To break this down a little bit by gender and race, we know that 95% of Black borrowers were not prepared to resume payments on May 1st. Thank goodness there has been a reprieve. However, continued payment pauses is not the same as lasting policy. And that is something that borrowers desperately need so they can plan their financial lives. We know that 8 in 10 women say that COVID relief for federal student loans and is the financial aid they currently depend on. And to expand on that, we know from student loan borrowers that the payment pause and 0% interest was by far the best pandemic relief that they received. It, you know, for some borrowers, this was $500 monthly for the last 2 years versus a one-time stimulus check. Low income and working class borrowers are more likely to use their monthly savings from the payment pause to pay again for basic necessities. These are not people that are going on vacations and buying fancy purses. They're paying for food and healthcare or medicine for themselves or their children. And then we also see from our survey that Black and Indigenous respondents were most likely to miss or will miss a payment on rent or mortgage once their student loan payments resume. And then half of transgender borrowers rate their current financial wellness situation as poor or very poor. So again, no surprise to those of us that have followed, you know, the student debt crisis. But we see that by and large, borrowers, and especially borrowers of color and women, are unable or not ready to make payments, frankly, at any time, whether it's August or early next year, until we employ some major fixes to the system. And I talked a lot about stories earlier, and so I just kind of want to touch on a few women that their stories have stayed with me. And first off is actually my good friend Rayanne, who just spoke today for the Senate Banking Committee on their series of workers dealing with student loan debt and the dignity of work. And Ray is an amazing woman. She works as a communications director, or one of them, at Planned Parenthood. So it was amazing. She took time today of all days. And, Ray, while she has a family and even was lucky enough to purchase a house, Ray, early on in paying back her student loan debt, fell into default. And even though she's paid $90,000 on her original $60,000 loan, she still owes tens of thousands of dollars and struggles to get her loan out of default. And it's just, this is somebody that can take care of every other financial part of their life, but student loan debt does not operate the same way as other debts. It's not as simple as your mortgage. I mean, I've even had IRS debts that were easier to pay back than my student loan debt. And then I think about Sabrina Calazans, who is in New York. Another great nonprofit worker. And Sabrina went to a private college where she thought she would get enough scholarship to pay for the cost of college. They changed the cost of tuition. She ended up with about $50,000 in debt. And even though Sabrina is a young 24-year-old, she's head of household for her family. And she has to, choose her jobs based on the student loan debt that she owes, but also the mouths that she has to feed and healthcare that she has to provide. I say this all to stress, these are not people looking for handouts. We talk about student debt cancellation. This is really a conversation, in my opinion, about fairness and equity. And we should want more for the next generation than we've received. Progress is always, I guess, going to leave people out. There are all these people that paid, we hear this all the time. What about those who paid their debts initially? Or what about those who never took out debt? Many people got COVID before we had a COVID vaccine, but I'm not mad about the vaccine. Progress is going to move us forward and going to help us. And yes, there will be people in the past that were able to do it the right way. They're the lucky ones. I can tell you that most of the people that struggled through the student loan system are not the ones saying kind of, what about me? Where they understand that struggle. So I just want to, remind you all to share your story and to get involved. It's really where we're at now is because of borrowers and advocates like AAUW and SBPC speaking up. I do not think that we would be in the place we are today if it wasn't for the millions of people that took to the virtual streets, so to speak, to get us here. So with that, I'll throw it back to you, Robin.
Thank you. Barbara, would you like to take it from here?
Thank you. I really appreciate all the information both of you shared. It's been really an eye-opener, I know. And it's been an eye-opener for me just being involved in putting this webinar together. So for our last part, before we shift to the Q&A portion, we want to take a minute to highlight a few key resources between us. So in addition to our three organization pages, you can also follow the coalitions in which we operate, and also utilize the information from TICAS, the Institute for College Access and Success. They have a report on what June 2020 graduates owed in student debt for colleges in each state. It's an interactive map, so all you have to do is click on your state and you can see what students owed at various colleges in your state. So now we can go to the Q&A.
Yes, all right. I know that we've already covered quite a few questions just in the course of our presentation. It means that all three organizations came prepared today. So thank you for sharing all of your information, Kat and Natalia, appreciate it. But first, I want to kick it off with a little bit what you just touched on, Natalia. One question we often see, all three of our organizations, is someone will ask a question comparing their experience with paying back student loans in past decades, and comparing it to what they see about student debt today. So I just kind of want to kick off our dialogue here with that. And like, how would each of you respond to that kind of approach?
Sure. So the cost of college is just outrageously more expensive than it was 30, 40 years ago, and even sooner than that. So I graduated high school in 98. And if I would have gone to school then, I went to UCLA. If I would have gone to UCLA then, it would have been about $8,000, but I worked and went to community college. And then when I went in 2006, it was $14,000. By the time I graduated, they had risen tuition 38% right after that. So we saw, especially in 2008, due to the financial crash, huge state disinvestment, meaning that the state stopped investing in their higher education budgets and put the cost onto the student and the parents. So we saw a huge increase in cost during that time, which thus has left us with far more student debt, not to mention how hard it can be to pay back your student loan debt. So it's just not your parents' student loan debt situation.
That's a good tagline. Not your parents' student loan debt. Kat, how about you?
I was gonna say, truly, I was like, Natalia, like just like hit it out the park. I would completely agree with that. And I think going back to like one thing I would emphasize, one, like Natalia said, again, we're now having student loan borrowers personally shoulder what was previously a public burden, right? Like, and I didn't want to call it a burden, like it was a public investment, right? In higher education. And then two, to her point earlier, is that we should want the system to be better. Like we are now at a place where we acknowledge 10 years later, like, you know, a decade plus later, that we're like, you know what, maybe that wasn't a good idea. Not maybe, we know that wasn't a good idea, right? And so how do we fix the system? Like, let's not just keep doing the same thing and do the wrong thing. Like, can we say, we've made a mistake, we didn't figure this out, let's try to wipe the slate clean, figure out how do we fix this, and then create a better system moving forward. But we can't say, we know we have a broken foundation, we know that we have all these other issues with the student debt crisis, then just say, okay, well, we'll figure out some type of plan. You have to like at least acknowledge that the system is deeply flawed and broken. And when we're talking about debt cancellation, it's saying this is one tool to get us back to a place where we're, again, back to public investment in higher education.
Absolutely. I just saw a follow-up question come through on like, what are major things that have occurred in the past 10 years that caused this ballooning of student loan debt? And whichever attendee asked that, thank you for that and how you worded it, because I truly think that between the two of your answers there, you have showcased that one, it's the cost of higher education, which comes from states divesting and federal funds not increasing, alongside the fact, you know, because of that, the cost of college has more than doubled in the past generation. And then alongside that, inflation has not kept up. You know, it is not balanced out. We have inflation, and then the actual compensation that everyone experienced upon graduating is not balanced. So the money amounts we're talking about are not, you cannot compare. And before we kicked off today, we were all joking that this comparison is not apples and apples. It's not even apples and oranges. I joke that it's apples and pineapples. We have another hilarious.
Or apples and spaceships.
Apples and spaceships. Yes, they're not, one's not even a fruit. So when you compare these numbers on a personal experience a generation ago, a decade ago even, that number does not mean the same that it does to me or to someone who's graduating even this year. Those numbers are not comparable.
And
so,
if I could just add,
yeah.
One thing that, you know, we couldn't solve this crisis right now. We, in the sense that we at Student Debt Crisis Center, and I know at Student Borrower Protection Center, are advocating for President Biden to cancel student debt by executive action. That's something that should be done by executive order. but Congress could be concurrently working on a bill to help us pay for the cost of college, whether it be free community college, free college for all, and that would solve the crisis once and for all. But I think it's important to note when we talk about student debt that while this is a higher education issue, it's also a consumer finance issue and a consumer protection issue, that so many borrowers are, we have more borrowers over the age of 30 than under. At the age of borrowers over the age of 50 are the fastest growing group of borrowers out there. And many people that have been out of school 10, 20 years and don't relate at all to being a student. So, we have to take care of this higher education problem, but we also have to take care of this consumer finance issue as well.
Absolutely. And then to speak to the other half of that, where it's the broken system, Kat, that you were talking about. I know that sometimes our conversations on student debt don't really cannot highlight the nuance between private and public loans and how there can be a difference. And then there are a lot of similarities with the predatory loan behaviors that both public and private can perpetuate, but definitely are more prevalent in that private space. So I'd love to just, again, reiterate some of that if you'd want to share.
Oh yeah, for sure. And I'm gonna say I have to say something about federal, because our federal services also made so many mistakes. But so one, I think to Natalia's point, there's definitely that huge consumer protection piece, because there's so many times again that servicers aren't counting payments. They've lied to borrowers, done so many things to keep borrowers off track. And so there is a really important piece about that. But then two, we also have a whole private student loan industry, right, that makes money in many different ways, and that we see many predatory behaviors. So whether it's in the form of, for example, income share agreements, which we know can adversely affect women and borrowers of color. If you're saying we're going to pick your loan rate based on where you go to school, your major, that is going to disproportionately is going to affect women and students of color. And we've seen ways in our research and our work that it affects, again, an outsized number of women, and then also students who might go to HBCUs or HSI. So really looking at the ways that, also, private lenders entering the space in a way that they're offering a solution to student debt or offering these other options, but that can adversely affect students, or whether it's that student borrowers have just fewer rights with private loans. So even something we saw during the pandemic, during the payment pause, again, something so powerful. I'm sorry, I'm going to go on a slight tangent too. I know someone just asked, what has changed in the last 10 years? I will say in the last 10 years, we can see that we can, pause student loan payments, pause interest, and see we're still
I didn't fall.
right. And so it's possible, we can do this. So I'll set that aside. But during the pandemic, we even saw, private student loan borrowers, struggling and kind of at the whim of their servicer, can you get some type of alternative payment plan? And so even having less access to different rights and privileges, if you're, it's say privileges, but different rights when you're struggling. But I mean, I can go through a laundry list of ways that we've seen private lenders, even the way that certain private lenders will work with for-profit schools. So again, when students may exceed their federal lending limits, and again, using these really high cost and risky private student loans to attend for-profit schools, when students may not get the same return on investment as the school is saying. But again, lenders are still funding these programs knowing that the student outcomes wouldn't necessarily justify the cost. But they're a laundry list, but I'll stop.
Absolutely. One question that I had that Barbara and I were talking about before this is if there is one policy item, one thing you could change, what would it be? What is your favorite policy solution that you would, if you could pick it and rubber stamp it? So either of you.
It's been passed or that we want to be passed.
No, that you want to. Something that needs to happen.
To cancel student debt. And the fact that we've now gotten to this place where we have proven the legal authority of it, which is the same authority we're using right now to keep your loans on pause at 0% interest rate, is the same authority they can use to cancel student debt. And it seems from the news reports we're getting that the president is in agreement. So I would say no matter how much debt we cancel, it should be all of it, but even if it's not, it's a huge win for the legal authority. And if we can cancel 10,000, we can cancel 50, and we can cancel all of it.
I just want to second that. That would be my, it's like cancel it all. So.
Yeah, we're definitely all on board with that one. To give an example, my favorite, very, very niche, small fix that I would love to see put through is to erase student debt from credit scores. If we were to take student loan debt out of the credit score factoring, that would, that doesn't mean canceling debt. It just means divorcing the two. That would itself be incredibly impactful on so many borrowers in this country who cannot secure safe housing because of a credit score, because they're still paying back their federal loans, or they defaulted because there's a pandemic or a recession. All of these different real world experiences of individuals. And I will say that this is from personal experience. You know, I defaulted, I graduated into the recession and defaulted in my loans. And then I lived in really unsafe housing for 8 years in Washington, DC. And that was because I could not, even though I could afford rent in a nicer place, I was not approved to live in a livable housing situation. So like it's little things like that that would have massive impacts for the livelihood and safety and economic security for borrowers that doesn't necessarily get into the bigger picture, but that's my little soapbox moment.
Well, and that actually ties in really nicely to the questions before of how has student debt changed from 25 years ago.
Yeah.
I'm old enough to remember that I was told, get student debt, it's good debt to have, right? Like this is debt that they'll look at and it will actually help you buy a house or help you get a credit card. Yeah, that was back when balances were $10,000, $15,000, you know, for a private school education. When the numbers started to balloon, it was no longer looked at as good debt, and in fact harmed you. When you don't even have to default to have it harm you. People are not getting houses. We're seeing the National Association of Realtors say one of the #1 reasons millennials can't get houses is because of their student loan debt. So yes to canceling it or divorcing it from credit scores, but you know, the only way out is through, and just being in this space for so long and seeing how broken this is, a failed experiment, and that's why we have to cancel all student loan debt.
Yes. I see a few more questions here. Barbara, which one? I know we had a good one to end on, and we are close to time. Let's take a look at a few more here. Okay, since we're talking about it, how would cancellation of student loan debt work? Would the federal government just pay off the loan?
It would just stop collecting on the loan. So the great thing is our tax dollars has already paid for this. We paid for this when the loans were taken out initially through the FAFSA system. So they would just have to stop collecting on the debts. We all got to remember that it actually cost us as taxpayers money to run the student loan system, which they've been running to the tune of a large profit, which was never the intention. So we wouldn't have to put out any new money. The government would just stop collecting like they have for the last 2 years with the payment pause. I don't know, Kat, you work more in the policy, so.
I was like, this is a great question. This is actually something we're trying to like figure out. Like we're thinking through like what does that look like based on the amount? Again, I know Natalia and I are very pro, we're like cancel it all, right? But like what does it actually look like depending on the amount? If it were 10K, if it were 50K, like what does that look like? But one thing I will say that it is also something that we're advocating again for a large, much higher than the 10K amount, and then also making sure that it's broad-based, it's not means tested, because one thing that we do know is that when you start trying to means test programs, one, you oftentimes will not reach the people who need the help the most, and then two, we know that income and wealth are different things, and so actually it may not have the intended effect of helping as many people as possible. So I mean, great question. Natalia, I too, we're trying to figure out what does implementation look like. So there's still questions there, but I will just add that I think that's why we're really in this space, and we really have this moment now to keep pushing, because we see that we're getting there on this issue. So let's get it across the finish line.
Well, and let's figure it out. That right there is a great answer. It's like, look, even if we don't have a clear cut message here and answer for it, we're at a critical point here. We need to figure this out. So let's crunch the numbers and figure out how that process works. And again, this also kind of goes back to the nuanced difference between public and private loans. I mean, like a lot of people, when we're talking about canceling student debt, we're talking about federal loans. And then others are like, no, I want it to be federal and private. Like, how do we approach that? It's like, well, let's figure it out is the answer for sure.
Yeah, we need to figure it all out. I would just say that
Yeah.
it's just wild to me that the federal government became a bank and is profiting off the backs of people that wanted to better themselves through education. And it's the easiest lever for them to pull is to cancel federal loans. Private is a little different in our capitalist country of trying to pay off private companies. So we're starting with federal. I don't know about you, Kat, but we're not going to go away if we just get 10 or even 50. We're sticking around until we get all student debt canceled and all student loan borrowers helped, public or private.
Absolutely. And I mean, that right there is the other smaller piece that always just fascinates me is the fact that the federal government provided loans to students and now charges interest and charges interest at a higher rate than our cost of living increase, you know, like all
You can't refinance.
Yeah. Just like, how is that real? And how is that not itself predatory of the federal government? One person in the chat said that, like, you know, federal loans can't be predatory, only private. I'm like, actually, no, a lot of these practices on a federal level are absolutely predatory.
Let's look at the fact that graduate loans and Parent Plus loans are at a higher interest rate than undergraduate loans. To me, that's like, once they know you're interested, they charge you more. In fact, and not less. If you've already proven you got through undergrad, it should be less, not more. But they see us as consumers and not as students and people that want to be educated, and that's the core of the problem.
Absolutely. I know that we're at time now, so I want to leave with one more question here. So as an advocate myself, I want to make sure that everyone today leaves with a deeper understanding of what it's like as an individual to live under the burden of student debt. And we've talked about it quite a bit, but what is the one nuance or perspective or storyteller experience that you can share that you want participants to walk away with today? It's a deep question, I know. It's a big one.
I guess it's a hard one because there's so many stories. Because I even think about, like, every time, like, we point to an issue when someone's like, you know, well, why don't you pay what you owe? We're like, actually, there are a lot of people who are paying more than they originally borrowed, right? There's stories about, like, you know, again, like, I don't know where to start, you know, stories about, like, going to school, being like, for like, I don't know where to start, because I feel like there's so many individual borrower stories for any kind of, like, retort I've ever heard about why we shouldn't cancel student debt. We have, like, so many stories about the way that the system is, like, crushed people, continue to do so, and, like Natalia said, treats students who are trying to go to education and seek some sort of upward mobility as consumers, when we're like, that's not quite what this should be. Like, so I don't know. I'm sorry, I don't have an answer there, because I'm like, I feel like
So many.
Yeah,
I agree with you. I think just wanting to, I want to dispel is kind of building on what you said, Kat, that this thing of fairness, that so many student loan borrowers have paid more than they originally borrowed. This is why they're not asking for a handout, and due to forbearances, deferments, which then compound and capitalize interest, especially if you do that multiple times. I've talked to borrowers, that have borrowed 40, paid 40, and still owe like 50, you know, because of that. So when we talk about fairness, I would assume no one thinks that people should be paying double for their education. And in fact, that is what's happening today.
Absolutely. Thank you. I think the only addition I have is that in addition to the fairness aspect, it is just driving home that student debt cancellation and ending the student debt crisis impacts all of us in this country, not just borrowers. That a healthy economy and a healthy society it just completely depends on everyone having a fair and equitable shot at success in this country. So for those of you who do not have, hold student debt right now, but are on this to learn, I want to, kind of drive that home, that this impacts you too. And it's about just the health of our entire society. But thank you both for joining. Thank you, Barbara, for organizing this with me. And I really appreciate the education and connection that you have brought to today for our collective coalition here.
Thank you, Robin. This is very needed today, and grateful to be here with you all.
Thank you. Likewise, this is so wonderful. Thank you all so much.
Thanks. Barbara, would you like to say anything?
I just want to thank everybody for participating. Like I said, I have learned a lot just by putting this together. And I just remember when I downloaded the TICAS report for my state and I sent it to my daughter because my grandson will be going to college in a couple of years. And she said, oh my goodness, I knew this was a problem, but I had no idea it was this bad. So I just, people need to get prepared and need to really understand how impactful this all is and how it can change lives, really.
Absolutely. Well, thank you all for joining us today. And we look forward to having this up on the website soon for everyone to rewatch.
Thank
Awesome.
you.
Have a great Tuesday.
Thank you.
Thank you.